Today we found out that the economy grew by 4.9%, which is the highest that we have seen in nearly 2 years. But what does it mean for the stock market? What does it mean for the economy? And what does it mean about the threat of recession? Let's go ahead and break it down. When we talk about the economy and how much it grew or shrank, we are usually referring to GDP, gross domestic product. And in Q3, we saw a 4.9% growth. Here's the thing though. This is real GDP, not nominal. What are the differences between the two? When we talk about nominal, it's just what the number is, right? Did it grow? Did it not? However, remember, GDP is the value of the stuff that we produce as a country. And some people think that, well, inflation is high, therefore GDP is just naturally going to be higher. This is why we come up with real GDP, because it factors in inflation. So you take inflation out of the calculation, the economy still grew by 4.9%, which is pretty good. You want the economy to grow, but we're in a space where the Fed is trying to slow this down just a bit. So let's answer a few questions that I got from Twitter, and I'll give you my commentary and thoughts on it. This is from my good friend, Michelle Jackson. I've been on our podcast several times. You need to follow her on all social media platforms. But one of the questions that she asked was, is this a recession? Like, are we in a recession? Are we going to head to one? My take here has been no. We are not in a recession now. We haven't really been in one since the pandemic. We haven't officially been in one since the pandemic. Now, we did have 2 negative quarters of GDP, which is the definition, the textbook definition of recession. But until the National Bureau of Economic Research comes out and says, yes, we are in a recession and confirms the dates, we have not officially been in one. So we're not in one now. People said we were supposed to be in one in 2023, and now just pushing it out until 2024. Now, what are the odds of being in a recession in 2024? It's really hard to call. It's extremely hard to call. I know that people feel bad, okay? But your feelings, my feelings included, don't mean that it's a recession. A recession is not a feelings indicator. It is the economy shrinking, yes or no? Now, we do know that there are some pretty negative stats out there. We know that credit card debt hit $1 trillion for the first time. We know that people's cars are being repossessed at a record number. None of those things are great. Doesn't make anybody feel good, and we still know inflation is still too high. None of that stuff is fun, right? None of that stuff is good. However, that is not what a recession is. Until the economy starts to shrink, we don't really have a recession. And until we stop adding jobs and we start to see that tail off, we're not really going to see one. And again, I ain't rooting for one anyway. But we know from the last 2 reports, the job market is fine. Okay, now we'll see what's going to happen in Q4. We've had conflicting reports at this point. I came out and reported when we did a video on what we expect from retail spending. It was still supposed to grow, but not at the rate that we've seen. But from this most recent report, the economy grew because consumer spending was strong. People were still spending money, whether it was back to school, vacations, whatever it was. People are still spending money left and right, which is generally a good thing. So for recession, no, we're fine right now. How long will it last? I'm not entirely sure, because again, we're going to run into a recession at some point in time. They happen in the US, okay? They don't happen in Australia, believe it or not, but they do happen in the US every 10 years or so. I'm not someone who is, going to put on a gloom and doom hat and just predict a recession every year until it actually happens. Right now, it does not seem likely, but that is right now. As the picture changes, as things grow and evolve, we'll see, right? There are a bunch of things that can happen to cause that. The most likely scenario is, now that student loan payments are coming back, are people still going to spend the exact same way that they were? That's a question. Is the Fed going to raise rates too high and push everything into recession? That is still a risk, but the Fed has seemed to care a lot about that, and they've paused the interest rate increases the last 2 times. So we'll see. Okay, we'll see. But the more we keep going through this, the less likely it becomes, at least in my eyes. But honestly, it is rare that anybody has been able to spot a recession before it happens. Nobody saw COVID coming. Nobody. Okay, now we did know that it started in China, what was it, in 2019, that, Q4 2019, when Nike and Apple got hit first when they started shutting down factories, but nobody knew it was going to be that bad and that it was going to last the way that it did. So it's extremely difficult for people to predict what's going to cause a recession and how that is going to come into effect. Next one here, is it irrational exuberance, or are all things actually fine? Fine is a relative term, okay? Because I would say that numerically things are fine, but like, am I fine, right? Are people next door fine? Are we okay when we go to the grocery store or pay for gas and things of that nature? I would argue, no, we're not. I would say the economy is fine, the consumer is not fine. I would say the consumer is not fine because, again, you hit record credit card debt, people's cars being repossessed. That's not fine, right? But I would also argue that pre-pandemic, things weren't fine then either. There's always this financial stat going around that the average American, or more than half of Americans, didn't have $800 for an emergency. That's not fine, right? That's not fine at all. We know what the student debt number was well before we got into this whole, forgiveness, public student loan thing. Before all that, we knew it wasn't great then either, right? So are we fine as a consumer? Probably not. As an economy, things are okay, at least right now. And then the other question here is, are we dealing with a mix of things? I would argue, yeah, we're dealing with a mix of things because we have to separate what the economy is doing, right? Because what the economy is what we produce, right? Now, it doesn't really count in how much savings we have as individuals or how much money we are putting into our 401ks and investing, even though we've talked about this earlier this year too, where we saw a higher number of people withdrawing from their 401ks, which would tell me the consumer, the individual, is not great, but you're still going to work and still producing stuff and people are still making those transactions. So it's really a balance. The way that we're looking at this and the way that I am looking at this is I'm looking at the definition of the question I'm being asked about the recession and about the economy. That's a different question when you're asking me about the person, the consumer, the investor, right? Those are two separate things. I don't think the consumer is in a good spot. I don't think the regular investor, in some cases, unless you're, subscribing to this channel, I don't think they're always in the best spot. But the economy is trudging along. Things are okay. Not great, but okay. And until we get down to a 2% level when it comes to inflation, then we're remaining in that okay space. Also remember that the unemployment rate is still historically low. That is still a good thing, and that doesn't scream recession at any point in time. It's not until GDP starts to really taper off and until we start to see that the unemployment rate starts to spike, that is when the real recession bell is going to ring, and that is why I'm going to start being concerned and start talking more about what we should do should we hit that level. My thing is this: I'm not hoping for that. I'm not wishing for that at all. I don't want a recession. I don't think that most people should root for that anyway, but some people just want to be right. So those are my takes on the economic state of things, but there are a few other things that you do want to know about how you should navigate periods like this, what stocks you should look into, and what their strategy should be right now. Those videos are right here.